Okay, so I am just sewing my shoulder seam and the top of my sleeve just on the overlocker. Now, if this starts to waver like this, you have what's called a differential feed on your overlocker, so you can turn it to stop it wavering, or you can make it gather up if you want to. So I can change that to stop that from wavering. If it's not going to waver when you're wearing it, but just so you know, you have the ability to change that. The other thing I want to show you is, one moment, what have I done? There we go. When you get to the end of your garment, just keep sewing. Like, you don't have to worry about sewing off on an overlocker because it won't jam up. You're better to carry on sewing, and then you can cut this one back or cut here, and then if you pull one of your pieces of overlocking thread, it will actually knot it up by itself, and then you can clip it back. So for this one, for my hem, I can do that. Okay? Oops, I think I went the wrong way. I went the opposite way, but that just shows you, and that'll press out, it's fine. Now, this is my sleeve end. So I'm just going to go like that. This is my neckband. So what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to, oh, there's my duckbill scissors. I'm going to cut this back because I'm going to be re-stitching on here, and I'm going to cut this back. So I'm going to get my shoulder seam to shoulder seam, and I'm going to get my halfway mark of the back of my garment, and I'm putting a pin in because this has to be very accurate. I'm then putting shoulder seam to shoulder seam, and I'm getting the front of my garment and putting a pin in there. Now here's the biggest thing you need. I've shown you before, but you can see clearly that the front is lower than the back. I'll show it. The front is lower at the back, correct? So when I go and put my next two pins in, they are not going to be at the shoulder seam because that is not the halfway mark. So I put my pin to pin, and I walk my fabric around, and you can see it is just before that shoulder seam. This is where people go wrong. They think the shoulder seam is the halfway mark, and when they go to put this on, it's just not right, and then it doesn't sit flat. So I will explain that as I do it. So walk this around and get exactly the halfway mark of your garment. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is turn this to the right side. Like so. And then make sure I'm starting at the back, not the front. So there's the back, and I'm going to put my centre back seam, which I've previously done, and it's nice and flat, onto my pin that marks my centre back. Then the next pin is going to be placed. So remember, this is the back, so the seam will go towards the back. The seam gets faced towards the back, but the pin goes to the pin. So I know that is exactly a quarter marking. And then I usually just put a clip to hold the seam. And then what I do is I just stretch my ribbing for round my neck onto my garment. And I put a pin at, say, this is my quarter marking, so I put a pin in between my quarter marking. So I know when I stretch that on, it's going to sit flat. And then I do exactly the same to this one. I get my pin, which is my next quarter mark. I bring it to my quarter mark pin, which is in front of my seam. I transfer my needle. I usually put a, oops, make sure your raw edges haven't tucked under, which they were. Make sure you put, I just use a clip on my seams to hold that flat. And then stretch this so it fits onto your neckband. Okay, and you do exactly the same if you're doing ribbing on a garment, because if you don't stretch this evenly, you'll get gathers in one place and not in the other. Then I put my last mark, which is my center front, and I find my center front pin, and I put pin to pin, like so, and then I stretch this on to my garment. Just like that, okay? And then this one, I stretch this onto my garment, and I do that. Now, if I don't want this to be bulky, I won't overlock it. I'll sew it on the sewing machine. So you decide whether you want it overlocked or you want it on the sewing machine. I think I'll just do it on the sewing machine to show you, because I'm going to top stitch it anyway. So I'd rather show you that method. Pin cushion is there. Okay, so if I have it ready on the sewing machine, I'm going to put back my 1D foot so it'll feed nice and evenly, and I'm going to clear my machine so it goes back to my normal sewing. And now I'm going to put it on a very, very narrow stretch stitch, so you can go back to your impoppable stitch. Now I'm going to sew it from the inside this way, and I can take the pins out because I've put the heads facing out, so it's very good. So I know that that is my centre back seam mark, so I'm just going to start it just before by that seam. And it's only a 1/4 inch seam. Now if you have a look, I think you can see it from there. I'm going to start sewing. Oh, foot control. Stole the foot control. I'm going to start sewing, and what I'm going to do is once I've started sewing, I'm going to make sure my needle stop down function's on, so that every time I stop sewing, the needle will stop down in the work. So I'm going to start, I'm not stretching at this stage, I'm just sewing. And stop. Now you stretch it to the first pin, and you can see all my fabric is, my edges are all even. And you stop before the second pin. And then you stretch and make sure all your edges are nice and even, and away you go. Now it's not a fast stitch, but it's a very strong stitch. When you're doing around the neck, that's probably the most stress on a garment, because it needs to go over your head every time you put it on, but it needs to remember how to sit nice and flat when you're finished. So let's see what it looks like when we do a stretch stitch and then top stitch as a finish, rather than overlock and top stitch. So when I show you my white top up close, you'll see I overlocked and top stitched the neck edge, and this one we're going to sew it on the sewing machine and edge stitch it on the sewing machine. Make sure my seam stays to the back. Oops, can you see that there? Ouch, pins hurt. So needle stop down is just a must, so good. And just lift it up so that the seam stays going the right way when you come to your seam. There you go. And then just carry on stretching it. And you shouldn't see any fabric over and above your foot width, but you should see your fabrics nice and evenly together. And that is how you get a really nice, perfectly fitted neckband, by halving and quartering, just like we've always done. Oh, I'll tell you a secret though. Make sure you try the neckband over your head or the children's head that you're making it for before you stitch it, just in case it's too baggy or it's too tight. So always fit it first and check, just in case. And then I'll show you what to do with your twin needle, and you will be able to sew lots and lots of garments together. It's very, very, very easy, and it's very, very effective. So we're nearly there. We're taking that last pin out. Make sure you bring all your edges up together. So you can see it's a lot quicker on an overlocker than it is on a sewing machine, but you can do it just, you can still do it on the sewing machine. Just takes a bit longer because the stitch will only go as fast as it can sew the stitch. So now I'm getting ready to overlap that last seam I'm going to completely sew up to it and overlap it. And you don't really backstitch this stitch, so I'm just going to overlap it. And then I'm going to cut it off, okay? So my finish on my neck edge is simply just my stitching line. Okay, now what I would do is I would just trim that off so it's all neat and tidy. Knit fabric like this likes to curl, and it's not very nice. So I'm just going to trim off a bit, especially at my shoulders. That's probably enough. Now what I'm going to do is I'm simply just going to sit it nice and flat. The seam has gone down, so the seam automatically goes down. And I'm going to put the number 10 edge stitch foot back on. I'm going to put my needle position to the right, and I'm just going to top stitch that on. Now a lot of people say, why don't you use your walking foot? Well, if I didn't have my jewel feed, I would. So did you know that you can get an attachment that goes on your walking foot? If you bought a new one, you'll have it, which is an edge stitch. So what that means is if you've got a screw on your walking foot, you can simply undo that screw and loosen off your normal foot. Do it a bit more. And you've got little lugs on here, and they just sit up in the little lugs. And when they're sitting in the right position, all you do, if they are, yep, all you do is, are we good? There we go, it kind of clicks in. All you do is tighten your little screw and make sure it's actually clipped in. There, you can hear it. So if you've got a walking foot, you can get a number 10 foot. So this is called the edge stitch attachment, and you can buy it separately if you've got that screw, because some walking feet come with 2 of these but not this one. So the previous ones never had it, but you can actually buy it for it. So you can put this on and do exactly what I'm going to do. So whether you've got this one or that one, you can do it, okay? So the walking feet, everything has got 20% off at the moment, so it's a great time to buy, and it is until the 22nd of May. So I'm going to start just before my back neck. Now, if I was putting this on a child's garment, I would get a little tab of fabric so they knew the back of their garment, because they wouldn't look at this. So I always put a tab. Now, here's what happens. Say I'm working on this table, and people say, well, how do you get round your arm? What I do is I take off my flat bed, and I just sit my garment down here, and I just use that. I don't bother popping my machine back up. I simply just put my garment down if I want to sew around there. So I find that just as easy, and then I can put my neckband all the way around my garment, and I don't have to think about it. So remember what I'm going to do. I'm going to put my straight stitch, my needle position all the way to the left instead of the right this time, and I'm lengthening it right out to 3.5 stitch length. It's going to top stitch that seam all the way around and give a really nice professional edge, and I'm just running. I haven't pressed it or anything, I don't need to. I'm running my edge stitch foot guide down my seam, and it's going to sit all my seams flat. Now if I found it was really, really bulky at the seam, I would use a height compensating tool to lift up this side of the foot, but it's not that thick because the fabric's soft, so I don't need to worry. But if I needed to, I would use my height compensating plate, okay? But it's not that thick because it's a soft knit. So you just simply edge stitch all the way around. You've got a beautiful finish. Then I'm going to put on the twin needle and show you how to twin needle the hems. Okay, and also twin needle the front edge if you want a feature. So I'll put on a dark, I'll put on a colour so you can see. So it's very, very easy. Just work your fabric around, whoops, so that you can come back to where you started. And I usually clip the thread where I started first, and then overlap it and backstitch a couple of stitches and lock it off. Okay, and that's how I do. I just think it's a nice finish. Okay, backstitch and cut. There we go. So there you see my neckband and my top stitching on my garment. And it's nice and flat and it gives a real feature. So it's very, very, very easy. Now remember for the hem what I'm going to do. For the hem, even though I've top stitched it, I'm still going to clip down and tuck away some of the bulk. So when I do this, I normally start my top stitching an inch from the hem, or 3 centimeters, so that when I clip it, I actually don't have top stitching in this bit here. Where's my little, yeah, here we go. So I forgot about that when I was showing you. So I don't actually have top stitching in this bottom bit. So these are quite handy little snips. They've got like a very sharp, quick unpick thing at the bottom. And I'm just taking out that seam, this bottom seam here. So normally I do remember to tell you that, but I'm glad I did that as a mistake because you won't do it. So you just take away that little, you start from your hem edge. So it's probably a blessing that I did that. I would have not reiterated it. So now that I've done that, have we got it all? Oh no, not quite. Once you've started, you can just pull it this way. It's much easier because you can see where the seam is. Okay, see how you can see the little... That's how I do most of my unpicking, especially on a knit fabric, because it's very, very, very easy to clip your knit fabric and not your thread. Just bring that out. So now you can see, here's my measurement, here's my hem, there's my 3 centimetre measurement. So there and there. Okay, so I've got one seam going one way, one the other, and then I will top stitch that all the way along. So I do that all the way around and I stitch right up here, an inch away from the edge. Okay, so I'm going to show you the twin needling, but first I'm going to show you the twin needling with the seam open and then the twin needling on the hem, just like that would be. Okay, so this is my flat seam and I'm going to twin needle on both sides, and this is my hem and I'm going to twin needle over here. Okay, and that one is... You can also do that. So there's your open seam and you're going this way, and this will twin needle just as well. Okay, because it's flat. But you can't do that with all knit fabrics. Some of them, they fray too much. They might be a real stretchy knit, and so it pays to overlock them or do something. But most knits you don't have to overlock. So there's all the twin needling. So remember, twin needle is blue for stretch. Okay, so when you're taking the twin needle, putting the twin needle in, the first thing you're going to do, wrong screwdriver but it works, the first thing you're going to do, I'll just take this off, whoops, is take your normal needle out and you're going to cut your top thread and you're going to take your top thread out, and I'm going to put some darker colours on here so you can see it. So I'm going to put, oh, I've lost one. Probably fallen in the rubbish bin. Oh no, there it is. Okay, so I'm going to put a dark navy on my needles so you can see them. So I'm going to put this needle. Now, if it's a knit that's quite a firm knit, you can use a 4mm twin needle. If it's a t-shirt, you probably need to go down to the 2.5mm twin needle. That's how the distance between the needles, so that you don't get a big channel through the middle. But on these heavier fabrics, I'm going to use a 4mm twin needle. So pop your needle up and either screw it up with this screwdriver or your Torx if you had it on hand. I'm going to put this back on. So I've got my flat bed. I use it all the time, off and on, off and on, off and on. But it's very easy to put on and off. And put my needle in my little spot. So that's a stretch needle that goes in there. And put my number 10 edge stitch foot back on. make sure you clear your machine and tell it what foot you've put on. So it's a 10D. Okay, so 10D. Now, because I've got a bar, I can now sew down both sides of my seam because I've got a bar to follow. So the foot, the bar of the foot is going to go down the middle of my seam, and it's going to stitch either side. Okay, so I'm going to thread it. Now you can do it individually, or you can do it like I do it, and I just have my foot up and I separate them at my tension at the top, and I go all the way along, and then this is my right one, this is my left. I separate them in the needle, and no, you cannot use your needle threader. So don't even try, because it does not work, obviously. It only can thread one needle at a time, not two needles. Okay? Yep. There's one, and there's two. And obviously, oh, that is not a needle. Sometimes you have to cut that on an angle. It's got a massive big furry bit on the end just to get that in. Cool. And then lift your foot up, make sure the threads are underneath like that. Make sure you've got enough thread in your bobbin. Not really, so luckily I checked. I'll put another bobbin in because it's getting to the end, that particular one. So it does pay to, I'll put a lime green thread on so you can actually see the stitching underneath. So it's not a bad idea to have a different colour when you're doing it, so you can check. And cut that thread. Okay, so I'm going to leave it on straight sewing, but I'm going to tell the machine I've got a twin needle on. So I'm going to tell it I've got a 4mm twin needle on it, and away we go. Longer stitch length, and now I'm going to stitch through the centre, and it's going to stitch either side of my work. It's brilliant. So nice long stitch because you are top stitching. And that is how you do your twin needling both sides. On the back, you get that angled zigzag, which is like a stretch zigzag, and so it actually stretches with your garment if you need it to. And then on the top you get this beautiful twin needling, which gives a feature to your garment. Okay, now if I wanted to, is this the one I've got my seam? If I wanted to, before I do that, I can actually, let's flatten this out and show you. I can actually do a fancy stitch, because who says you just have to do straight stitch with twin needling? You can do anything you like. So I'm going to go to the stitches, and the machine will know what size I can do. So this is a twin needle, and it is interesting stitch, so I'm going to lengthen it out. Don't know how it's going to work, just going to try it. So it's going to do like a little tree. And I'm just watching where it's going down the side, down the centre, and I am going to do a twin needle fancy stitch. So the sky's the limit. Doesn't matter what you want to do, you can do anything you want. So I don't go fast when I'm doing things like this, but it's just showing you, you don't just have to stick to straight sewing. Very clever. And there you have a twin needle, but you've done a really cool finish on it. Oh, thread. That looks amazing. And it's got stretch. So, you know, you don't just have to have it plain. Now for hemming, you're on straight sewing, or you could do something like that if you wanted. The secret with this is you put your normal foot back on. I always bring my threads through my foot, wherever it is, there. Put my foot on, put my jewel feed down. Now, don't sew close to that folded edge, sew at least 1.5 upwards so that you don't get the stretch of your garment on the machine, but you can make the foot pressure longer. So I'm going to put it on, 3.6 for twin needling. I've got my 1D foot on, so I'm going to tell my machine. All of these little things you've got to do, but it makes all the difference. So now this is how I hem. So I've got my mark on my machine, and that's about 2 centimetres. So I'm looking at that. A moment. I've twisted my thread. I could see it twisted before I started, so I've stopped straight away, because otherwise I may have broken my needle. So I don't know what happened there, but I can see somewhere I twisted that. It must have been when I threaded with the foot. I can see it, look, back here. So you don't keep going if you see that. Just stop and regroup, because otherwise I would have got a big mess. See what happened? So don't keep going. So I'm going to cut that off, and I'm just going to rethread those. Check which one's on the right, which one's on the left, and put it in the needle. So I probably shouldn't have done that when I threaded it. So that one's the right, and this one's the left. There we go. So I'm just going to redo that. It pays to check that, because you don't want to break a needle, because they're not a cheap item. And just put that in there. So this time, to get that thread through the back, I'll just put the balance wheel down, the needle down once and back up, and I'll pull it from the bobbin thread. So my threads are through to the underneath. So I'm just going to do, you can push it on your machine, 1 stitch down, 1 stitch up, and pull the threads from here. Okay, then it's not going to happen. So now all you do is you simply just top stitch, and there's your beautiful finish. Just follow your marking on your machine where you're going to have it. And when you come to here, unless it's thick, if it is thick, and you want to put your little upside down, your little plate, or just go this way, it's only a little bit. This will just lift it up a little bit to go over your little hump if you needed to. You really don't need to on this fabric, it's lovely and soft. And there you get a beautiful finish, and you won't get any bulk or any skip stitches, because you've already flattened your seam. And the best thing about it, the last thing I just want to tell you, is it stretches. So it's not going to pop, because you've used the correct needle, the correct thread, ordinary strong thread, and you've got a beautiful finish on your garment. Okay, so that's twin needling, obviously in the correct colour. But that's what I'd like to show you, because I think all of those tips will make your sewing of your winter garments really, really, really professional. So enjoy, enjoy.